My name is Patricia, and although I'm now 32, I distinctly remember the moment when my life began to unfold the way I wanted it to. Now I work as a leading specialist at a cosmetology company that creates high-end professional cosmetics, the kind sold not in regular stores, but in private salons where women entrust us with their secret hopes for youth and beauty. The work is incredibly demanding, and sometimes I return home feeling as if I've lived two lives in a single day. But I don't complain because the pay is truly worth it. 2 years ago, I was able to afford my own apartment, and for me, it symbolized that I was finally independent, that all my efforts, all my sleepless nights in college, and all my hard work were worth it. Now that the walls of my apartment have become familiar, the thought of something bigger keeps popping into my head, a place where I can escape the frantic pace of the city, a house by the lake with a wide terrace where soft light falls in the morning, reflecting off the water, and where I can sit with a cup of coffee, listen to the silence, and feel as if the world has finally left me alone. This idea has been haunting me for weeks now. I imagine the wind rustling my hair, escaping there on weekends, and this imagination brings me almost physical relief. Sometimes at work, everything devolves into complete chaos. Calls, reports, endless presentations, and at such moments, I especially hear the hum of the city in my head, the noise that never stops, and I feel as if I simply couldn't cope without this little corner by the water. I decided to share this dream over dinner when we were all gathered around the table, because conversations in my family were always difficult and multi-layered, and I knew the reactions would be mixed. To explain why this idea is so important to me, I need to go back to my childhood. My parents divorced when I was only 12, and then life began to be divided. 2 months with my dad, then 2 months with my mom, and so on and so forth, until I felt like a ball being passed from hand to hand with no regard for his feelings. My dad remarried just a year later, and while many in my position would probably have greeted a stepmother with caution, Kendra was a gift to me. She entered my life gently, without pressure, without trying to take my mother's place, and I felt in her someone who truly wanted my well-being. When Jake, her son, was born, I was already a teenager, and despite the 4-year age gap, we quickly found common ground. He gravitated toward me like an older sister, and I reciprocated, having never had anyone with whom I could share simple joys. Mom, however, moved forward much more slowly. Only 3 years after the divorce did she remarry, and her new husband, Richard, struck me as cold, as if every smile he gave were studied, not genuine. He had a daughter, Amanda, 2 years older than me, and I immediately felt like I was an outsider in her eyes, like my presence was disrupting her order. From that day on, every trip to see Mom became an ordeal. I always felt like there was no place for me in that house, and gradually I began to dread those 2 months. With Dad and Kendra, it was like I was transported to another world. Kendra helped me with my studies, sat next to me while I struggled with algebra problems. Jake invariably pulled me toward the PlayStation, and Dad, for the first time in years, looked happy and even laughed. But with Mom, it was different. There, I lived on guard, as if every word or movement I made could backfire. At 16, I finally decided to talk to her. I rehearsed the phrase in my head for ages, until one evening, as we sat in the kitchen, I said, "Mom, I think I want to live with Dad full time." I expected screams, reproaches, tears, but she simply looked at me, nodded, and said quietly, "If that's what you want, Patricia." I could have sworn she sighed with relief at that moment, as if I were a burden she'd been carrying for too long. It was painful, but at the same time, I felt like I could finally find stability. From then on, I lived with my dad and Kendra, close to Jake, and rarely saw my mom, mostly just texting. And gradually, I began to think she was much more interested in being a part of Amanda's life. When Amanda had her own family, Mom became a true grandmother. Photos of her granddaughter flashed across her social media every day, each captioned with a message about how much joy and happiness she brought. And yet, when I graduated from high school, it was Dad and Kendra who were there for me. They not only supported me when I decided to go to college, but they also offered to pay for my education because they believed in me. I chose chemistry, and Kendra said, "This is an investment in your future, Patricia." Mom didn't even come to my graduation, and that was the moment when I finally realized who my family had truly been all these years. Studying at college wasn't just fascinating, it was truly captivating because every day felt like opening doors to a new world. Chemistry gradually ceased to be a dry science for me and became a language for explaining the beauty and benefits of things people use every day. This is what led me to the field of cosmetics, where I felt I could combine science with a woman's desire for self-confidence. I sat in lectures wide-eyed, absorbing every formula and every experiment. And then, when my internship began, I realized that this entire foundation would one day be the key to a real profession. Skincare's scientific developments, their attention to detail and scientific evidence of their products' effectiveness seemed almost magical to me, and I poured everything I had into my studies. And to my surprise, I began to excel, not just well, but truly outstandingly. After graduating, I received a job offer from a prestigious company, and that moment has always remained etched in my memory, because I realized then that this was my chance, my future, and I had to grab it with both hands. My salary quickly began to rise, and along with it, my confidence grew that I could build my own life without relying on anyone else. During those years, I barely communicated with my mother. It was as if we lived in different universes. She was completely absorbed in caring for Amanda and her little daughter, posting endless photos of her granddaughter, writing long, enthusiastic captions, and I realized there was no room for me in her new life. And at some point, I decided I wouldn't knock on a closed door, that I'd rather focus on my family, on my dad, Kendra, and Jake, who truly cared about me. But 2 years ago, something happened that I still call strange and even inexplicable. One ordinary evening, as I sat at home with my laptop, planning my work week, my phone rang and the name Mom appeared on the screen. I picked it up with a chill in my chest, and she, as if nothing had happened, said, "Patricia, I miss you. I think we should try to reconnect." At that moment, I didn't feel anger, but rather caution mixed with curiosity, and after a short pause, I agreed to meet. We chose a small cafe on the corner, and when I walked in, I immediately noticed that Mom looked different. A warmth had appeared in her gaze that I hadn't remembered since childhood. She asked me about my job, my apartment, inquired if I was happy with my income, and at some point, I thought that maybe the day had finally come when she decided to be a real mother to me, the kind I so lacked as a teenager. We started seeing each other more often, and she started calling every couple of weeks to ask how projects were going, if I was saving money, if I needed anything for the house. At first, these calls warmed my heart. Sometimes she'd mention her struggles, like the electric bills had gotten higher, or my salary wasn't enough to cover groceries, and I wouldn't hesitate to send her a little money, not an amount that would bankrupt me, but enough to help. Inside, I felt it was the right thing to do. A good daughter who wouldn't abandon her mother, even if her mother had once abandoned her. And now, sitting in my apartment late on a Friday night, I thought with such excitement about the lake house, about how important it was to share this dream with the people I loved most. Dad, Kendra, and Jake. They were my true support system, and I knew they would be happy for me in a way Mom never could. Jake was 28 now, with his own apartment, his own worries, and a girlfriend, but there was still that closeness between us that couldn't be broken. And I imagined how tomorrow night we'd all sit down at Dad and Kendra's table, and I'd tell them my plan. I'd been browsing through listings, looking at photos of houses, and imagining one of them becoming mine. They wouldn't be palaces, just a cozy little house an hour outside the city, a place I could come to on weekends and holidays, take a break from work, and maybe invite my family over for small get-togethers, where laughter and the smell of freshly brewed coffee would mingle with the silence of the forest and the sound of splashing water. Saturday evening at Dad and Kendra's house turned out to be exactly how I'd imagined it. I stepped through the door and immediately smelled the familiar aroma of stew, the best Kendra ever cooked, filling the kitchen with warmth. Dad, as always, hugged me tightly, as if he were afraid to let go, and Kendra, smiling, kissed me on the cheek. She placed the glass of wine I'd brought in front of me and said with a curious smile, "You seem a little nervous about something, Patricia. What's going on?" I couldn't help but smile and replied, "I'm thinking about buying a house in the country, right by the lake." My dad's face lit up with such pride that my eyes stung. "That's wonderful, Patricia. You've worked so hard for this." I felt like a little girl again, waiting for his approval, and mustering up my courage, I added, "Of course it's a big step, but I've been saving up, and with my salary, I can afford the mortgage." Kendra clapped her hands happily and said, "Darling, we're so proud of you." A house by the lake. That sounds wonderful. I looked at them both and added, "The best part is, you can come visit whenever you want. And Jake can too, with his girlfriend. We could spend family weekends there." We talked about it all dinner, and the conversation flowed easily, filling the room with laughter and hope. Kendra asked about the area where I'd been eyeing houses. My dad perked up when he heard about the fishing, and I showed them photos of several properties right on my phone. They were genuinely happy for me, and it showed in every look they gave me, in every question they asked. For they weren't just asking politely, but out of genuine interest about the area, the price, how soon I planned to make my move, and even whether I needed help with paperwork or with renovations, if I wanted to remodel something. As we washed the dishes together after dinner, Kendra leaned toward me and said quietly, almost conspiratorially, "This is a very smart investment, Patricia, and you deserve a place where you can truly relax, where no one will tug at your sleeve or demand too much." I laughed and admitted that I kept thinking about sitting on the porch in the mornings with a cup of coffee, listening to the birds chirp in the woods, and watching the sun rise over the water, painting the sky golden. Dad listened, smiling, and suddenly said, "That sounds like heaven, Patricia. Your mother would be proud." I froze for a second, his words striking an unexpected ache within me, as I hadn't even planned to tell Mom about my plans yet. I nodded and said, "Actually, I have dinner with her next week. I'll tell her then." And so, the following Saturday, I found myself at my mother's house. As I approached the front door, I felt a strange sensation. Though I'd been there many times over the past 2 years, since we started talking again, this house had never felt as familiar to me as my father and Kendra's. Mom greeted me with a hug, and I immediately caught the scent of her perfume, the same one she'd worn years ago. It was like a return to childhood, only then it had been the scent of warmth. Now it reminded me of something unsaid. Richard was also home, calm and detached as always, and Amanda had arrived to visit with her 11-year-old daughter, Emma. "Patricia," Amanda drawled, her voice too cheerful, a hint of deliberate falseness. "So, how are you? Still getting your huge paycheck?" I smiled reservedly and replied, "Everything's going well," as I sat down at the table. Emma, sitting nearby, coloring in a book, glanced at me briefly, muttering something in response to my greeting. Mom served her traditional lasagna, and we chatted for a while about trivial matters. Richard was talking about how things were going at his hardware store. Amanda was complaining about her husband spending too much time at work, and Emma was demanding more juice every few minutes. I sat there, listening to their conversations, feeling my impatience growing inside me as I finally shared my news. Finally, I couldn't resist saying, "I have some amazing news to share with you. I've decided to buy a lake house. I've been saving up for a while, and I think it's time to invest in something like this." I expected at least a smile or words of encouragement, but instead, I noticed a strange glint in my mother's eyes. She carefully put down her fork, looked straight at me, and slowly said, "A lake house." How wonderful. An expression I'd never seen before crossed her face, as if she were calculating something in her head. Then she leaned toward me and said, "I'll be 60 in 4 months. This could be the perfect gift. You could give me this house for my birthday. It would be truly generous, a real gift, and we could all use it. You could still come there on weekends." I nearly choked on my water. "Mom, that's a very expensive gift." I said, feeling my voice waver. I was going to buy this house for myself. Her face immediately changed, dulled, drawn. For myself? But Patricia, think how wonderful it would be if we all had a place to come. Richard, Amanda, and Emma would all benefit from it. I tried to explain gently, I don't mind you coming there at all, of course, but I want the house to be mine. At that moment, Amanda let out a loud laugh and said, Come on, Patricia. You make a good living. Why be greedy with your own mother? I felt my cheeks heat up and said firmly, It's not about greed. It's just a smart decision. The house is a huge gift, too big. My mother's face turned cold, and she said in a voice that made me uneasy, I think you should think carefully about what I asked of you, Patricia. Family has to come first. The rest of dinner passed in tense silence, although my mother tried to smile and steered the conversation toward small, mundane topics as if nothing had happened, but there was a heaviness in the air that made me want to get up and leave immediately. Richard glanced up at me from time to time, and each time he looked at me, there was a silent condemnation in each one, as if I'd made an unforgivable mistake by refusing my mother's wishes. Amanda sat across from me with a smug smile, her gaze clearly saying, See, you've made a fool of yourself. I felt like an outsider at this table, even though technically they were my family, and every sigh they took felt like a reproach. When I got home that evening, the first thing I did was pour myself a large glass of wine and sank onto the sofa, trying to process what had just happened. I replayed her words over and over again. My mother wanted me to buy her a house that cost over $300,000, as if it weren't the result of my years of hard work, but simply a luxury I owed her. The more I thought about it, the more anger boiled inside me, because I remembered how hard it had been all these years, how I'd worked so hard to get a position at the company, to gain stability, to save for a down payment. I'd saved every penny, lived carefully, denied myself so much for this dream, and my mother decided she could erase it all with one sentence and turn my work into her anniversary gift. I remembered how many times over the past 2 years I'd wired her money when she complained about the electric bill or not having enough for groceries. $50 here, $100 there. And I did it not because I had to, but because I believed that that's what a good daughter does. That's what a person who cares about others does. But now it seemed to me like it had all been a test. Step by step, she was figuring out how much more she could get from me. By the time I finished my wine, my decision was final. I was not giving her the house, period. It was inappropriate, unfair, and even cruel to ask such a thing. If Mom wanted a house by the lake, let her save up and buy it herself. With this firm decision, I felt a sense of relief, as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The next morning, I called my friend David, who worked as a realtor. Remember how I mentioned lake property? I asked. I think I'm ready to get serious about this. David perked up and replied, Sure, I'll start researching options. Tell me your budget and what exactly you're looking for. We talked for almost an hour, discussing the details. A small but cozy house, not too big, but with direct access to the water, preferably no more than an hour's drive from the city, with a veranda to sit on in the mornings and evenings, and the ability to host guests on the weekends. He promised to call as soon as a suitable property became available. 2 months passed, and then one evening my phone rang. David's voice was clearly excited. Patricia, I found your house. It matches your description perfectly, and it just hit the market. We need to go see it today. I didn't hesitate for a second and went with him that very day. As we pulled up, my heart started pounding. A small 2-bedroom cottage stood before me, with a wooden veranda that hugged the entire perimeter, and the lot overlooked the water, where the lake sparkled in the rays of the setting sun. The house was simple, but its simplicity exuded the harmony I'd dreamed of. The price was way out of my budget, but with a mortgage, I could afford it. I didn't even wait for the viewing to be over. I turned to David and said, I want this house. 3 weeks later, all the paperwork was signed, the deal was closed, and I stood in front of my very own lake house, keys in hand, feeling like I was holding a piece of a dream come true. I took a selfie with the house in the background, smiling so widely my cheeks hurt, and posted it on Facebook with the caption, "Dreams do come true." I finally have my own lake house. I wandered through the rooms, examining my new home, touching the walls with my hands as if checking to make sure I wasn't dreaming when the phone rang. The name Mom was on the screen. I pressed the button, and her voice came through the phone, sharp, angry. "Patricia, I just saw your message. Why didn't you consult me before buying this house?" I froze in the middle of the living room, looking out the large window at the lake, and replied, "Consult you? Why would I?" Her voice grew even colder and more commanding. "Because I'm still buying this house. You're lucky I like it." I sighed heavily, gathering all the weariness of the past few weeks into my chest, and said quietly but firmly, "Mom, we've already talked about this. I'm not giving you my house for your birthday." A sharp, angry hiss came from the other end of the line. "You're selfish, Patricia. I've dreamed of a country house for years, and you have money pouring in like a river, and it would mean everything to me." And suddenly, without warning, her voice broke, and she began sobbing. Not quietly, not restrainedly, but hysterically, like a small child denied a toy. "I can't believe my own daughter wouldn't do this for me," she cried through her sobs, and then, without waiting for my response, hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand, staring at the blank screen, listening to the silence in my living room, and feeling my insides clench with either pain or anger. After a minute, I simply shook my head and put the phone down. This was ridiculous. I wasn't going to call her back and listen to her manipulations again. 2 weeks passed, and I found myself back at Dad and Kendra's for dinner. Their home had always been a place for me to breathe, where it smelled of food cooked with love, and where people looked at me with warmth, not demand. But that evening, I needed more than just Kendra's delicious stew and my father's jokes. I needed their understanding. I poured it all out, told them what had happened last week. Kendra, drying her hands on a towel, shook her head. "This is completely unacceptable, Patricia. Please tell me you're not even considering her request." "Of course not," I replied, but pulled out my phone. "She doesn't stop." "Here, look." I showed them the messages, one after another, insistent, almost demanding, all about how tired she was of the city life, how she deserved a place to rest, how I should put my family first. Kendra frowned and said firmly, "This is emotional blackmail. You have no right to give in." Dad was silent longer than usual, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and serious. "Patricia, your mother never put you first. Not when you were a child, not now. You don't owe her a house. You don't. Period." Their support warmed me, and I felt like I could breathe again. From that moment on, I decided to ignore almost all of my mother's messages, responding only to the neutral ones, those that didn't concern the house. But the closer her 60th birthday approached, the more desperate her messages became. I watched her words turn into reproaches, complaints, threats, and it all weighed heavily on my shoulders. When her birthday arrived, I thought, okay, I'll give her a gift. But it won't be a house. It'll be something sensible, generous, but not crazy. I went to the dealership and picked out a small used car. Not new, not luxurious, but much nicer than her old car, which was already on its last legs. The car was in excellent condition, cost around $15,000, and I thought it was a fitting, generous gift. I asked that the keys be packaged in a beautiful jewelry box to make it look festive. The dealership agreed to hold the car until the end of the party, and we agreed that I would then drive my mother to pick up her new car. When I arrived for the party, Mom greeted me at the door with a beaming smile and hugged me tightly, as if none of this had happened. The house was bustling. Her friends, Richard's family, neighbors I barely knew. Everyone was congratulating her, laughing, raising glasses. "Patricia, my dear, come sit next to me," Mom said, leading me to the chair next to her. Leaning over, she whispered, "I really hope your gift will be a good one." I just smiled and remained silent, deciding to let her think for a moment before opening the box. The party dragged on. people chatting about trivialities, telling stories about Mom, laughing, taking photos. I tried to be polite, but inside I felt a tension, as if the entire celebration was built around her anticipation. Finally, the moment for the gifts arrived. Mom stood up, tapped her glass with a fork, and the room gradually grew silent. "My dears," she began loudly, "today is a special day. And my daughter Patricia has prepared an amazing surprise for me." I felt my heart clench, skip a beat, and my breath hitch. What was she doing? And then, smiling proudly, she said, "Patricia has decided to give me her beautiful new lake house for my birthday." The entire audience burst into applause, and I felt as if I were in some strange dream where people, unaware of the whole truth, congratulated my mother, admired her luck, and told me what a generous daughter I was. I stood in the center of this performance, disbelieving my eyes and ears, as if I'd been thrust into a play without rehearsal, where the role had been thrust upon me and the words forced into my mouth. My mother, beaming with her triumphant smile, looked at me expectantly, clearly expecting me to stand up and confirm her fantasy. But inside, I clenched, and I realized I wouldn't play by her rules. I rose slowly, looking her straight in the eye, and handed her the small box that meant so much to me. "There are no keys to the lake house here, Mom," I said calmly, but my voice trembled. "But I'm sure you'll love what I made." And at that moment, her expression changed so quickly it was almost frightening. Delight gave way to bewilderment and then to fury, so cold and sharp that the room fell silent for a second. She snatched the box from my hands and, without opening it, ran into the kitchen. I heard the trash can lid open and close, and a minute later she returned, without the box. "I threw it out," she said in an icy voice. "There is no room for greed and selfishness here. Get out." Some of the guests looked down. Some whispered awkwardly, trying to fill the tension with empty words. But I noticed Richard and Amanda exchange glances and nod, as if in support of her crazy prank. "You've disgraced yourself today, Patricia," Amanda said with that same nasty smile that always made me shudder. I didn't answer her, didn't make excuses or argue. I simply stood up, walked into the kitchen, and leisurely pulled the box out of the trash can. She didn't even open it. Clutching it in my hand, I walked to the door and walked out of the house, leaving this theater of the absurd behind me. The walk home seemed endless, and when I finally arrived at my apartment, I was shaking with anger and resentment. I immediately called Kendra. "She threw your gift in the trash without even opening it," I said, and Kendra's angry, indignant voice came over the phone. "How could she?" "Patricia, honey, I'm so sorry." And then I couldn't take it anymore. The tears started flowing, and I sobbed as I told her everything. How my mom had announced to everyone that I'd given her a house. How she'd made a fool of me in front of her friends. How in the end she'd simply destroyed my gift without even looking at it. "I want to call her right now and tell her everything I think," I breathed through my sobs. Kendra begged, "Please don't do this. Don't stoop to her level." But inside, I felt only one thing. I wanted closure. When we hung up, I was left sitting alone, holding the box of car keys in my lap. I looked at it and thought, what now? Return the car and get my money back? Or find someone else who needs it? And suddenly it dawned on me. I have someone who truly deserves this gift. The next morning, I went to see Dad and Kendra. The keys were in my pocket and my heart was beating fast like a teenager's. When Kendra opened the door, I looked at her and said, "I have something for you." I handed her the box and added, "This was supposed to be Mom's birthday present." She threw it away without even opening it. "But I want you to have it, because you were a real mother to me." Kendra opened the box, and her eyes immediately filled with tears when she saw the keys. "Patricia, you can't give me a car," she whispered, clearly shaken. "I can," I replied, hugging her shoulders. "You've done more for me than my own mother. You deserve it." She burst into tears and hugged me so tightly that for a second I couldn't breathe, but it was a hug full of love and gratitude. "I love you so much, darling," she said, and together we went to the dealership to pick up the car. It was perfect for her. Comfortable, Small, easy to drive, reliable, and safe. I looked at Kendra, beaming with happiness behind the wheel, and felt like for the first time in a long time I'd done something truly right. I took a photo of her next to the car, so happy and surprised, and when I got home, I posted it on Facebook with the caption, "When your birth mother rejects a gift, you give it to someone who truly deserves it. This car is in good hands now." The next morning, at precisely 7, just as dawn was breaking and I was still hoping for a good night's sleep after a difficult night, my phone rang and my mother's name appeared on the screen. My heart sank, but I didn't pick up. One ring led to another, then a third, and when she realized I wasn't answering, the messages poured in, one after another, short, angry, and crushing. "Patricia, you have to give me that car. It was my birthday present. I can't believe you could do this to me. That car belongs to me. You're stealing me." I stared at those words, my insides turning cold, and then I simply deleted them without replying. She made her choice the moment she threw the gift in the trash without even looking at it. 2 days passed. I came home from work, put some water on the pasta, turned the music down, and tried to relax a little when suddenly someone started knocking loudly and insistently on my door. I went to the peephole and saw Mom and Amanda. Both were furious, their faces twisted, their eyes blazing. I realized this moment was inevitable, and it had to come sooner or later. I took a deep breath and opened the door. "How could you do this to me?" Mom screamed, pushing her way inside without an invitation, bumping into me with her shoulder. Amanda followed, slamming the door behind her, as if she was afraid I'd chase them out into the stairwell right then and there. "You lied to everyone!" Amanda screamed so loudly that I flinched. "You made Mom look like a fool in front of her friends, and then you gave her gift to some other woman." I couldn't help but laugh, nervous but genuine. "Her gift?" I repeated. "The one she threw in the trash without even opening it?" "I didn't know what was in the box," Mom cried, and there was a falseness in her voice that made me shudder. "You should have told me," she added more quietly but still accusingly. I shrugged and, looking her straight in the eye, said, "You showed me how much you loved me, Mom. You threw away my gift without even looking at it. You were only interested in one thing, getting a house by the lake." "That's not true," she began, but stopped mid-sentence, and the silence in the room became so thick that I could hear the water gurgling softly in the pot in the kitchen. She realized how false her words sounded. Then she suddenly sat up and blurted out, "You know what? Fine, I'll sue you. I'll sue you and get that car back." I laughed again, calmly this time. "Good luck with that. I have photos of you throwing my gift in the trash and 20 witnesses who saw it with their own eyes." Her face turned white, realizing that in her fury, she hadn't even considered that not only I but dozens of people had witnessed her act. "I was joking about the lawsuit," she muttered quickly, as if trying to smooth things over, but then added, "But you have to give me my car back." "You're my real mother, not your stepmother," she cried, almost pleadingly. "Kendra loves me," I said firmly, "and you only love my money. That's the only difference." "That's not true," she cried, her eyes filling with tears. "I love you." "No, don't," I replied calmly, even wearily. "If you loved me, you'd be glad that I have a home, that I'm happy. Instead, you tried to take it away from me. You threw away a gift worth $15,000 just because you didn't think it was worth enough." Amanda stepped forward, her voice laced with malice. "You're ridiculous, Patricia. Mom deserves that car more than your stepmother." "Get out," I said, gesturing toward the door. "Both of you, and don't text me anymore." They didn't leave right away. Mom was still crying, covering her face with her hands. Amanda continued muttering something about what an ungrateful daughter I was, but eventually they did. I closed the door behind them and turned the lock, then poured myself a large glass of wine and, for the first time in a long time, felt a strange, bitter, yet liberating peace. That was 8 months ago. Since that night, I haven't spoken to Mom, Amanda, or Richard. At first, Mom tried calling and texting, but I blocked her number, and gradually her persistence faded. Eventually, she gave in, and I felt like my life had gotten better. Now my weekends are spent at my lake house, reading on the porch, listening to the soft rustling of the trees, or swimming in the cool water. And for the first time in years, I don't have to explain myself to anyone. Dad and Kendra come visit often, and Kendra loves getting behind the wheel of that very same car. She says it gives her a sense of independence, that it's her little freedom. Jake comes over too, and his girlfriend Emma is with him. They love sitting around the fire in the evenings, cooking and talking about the future. And in those moments, I look at them and think that perhaps this is it. True happiness. Quiet, peaceful, but mine. Last month, Jake timidly asked me if he could propose to Emma right here, at my lake house. And without a moment's hesitation, I replied that this place was made for family, that within these walls and on this land, only the most important and brightest should resonate. That evening, as the sun was setting and the water turned a rosy gold hue, he dropped to one knee right on the old wooden dock and offered her a ring. And she, in tears and laughter at the same time, said yes. Now they're planning their wedding, and Jake came to me again, this time asking if they could have the ceremony by the lake, and I felt such happiness knowing that my location was the symbol of their future. Kendra is already making plans, talking about how beautiful it will be to decorate the porch with fresh flowers, how they can set up long tables on the lawn, cover them with white tablecloths, and string garlands of lights between the trees so that everything sparkles with a soft glow when evening falls. Dad, with his practical yet touching enthusiasm, has already taken up the idea of hanging lanterns and garlands himself. He wants his son's wedding to be a true celebration. I look at this and think that everything will be truly wonderful. Sometimes, sitting alone, I think about my mother and wonder if she ever regrets what she did, that she ruined our relationship, choosing greed over warmth, control over love. But I'll be honest, I don't miss that endless drama. I don't miss her demands, those calls where every word boiled down to money or complaints about me not being good enough. I don't miss the feeling that my value to her lasted only as long as I wrote her a check. But now I have what I always wanted, even if I didn't realize it at first. Kendra calls me every week just to chat, not to ask for anything, not to reproach me, but simply to find out how I'm doing, what I've been reading, what my plans are for the weekend. Dad sends me silly memes and photos of the fish he caught, laughing that he now has a new record. Jake sends me photos of wedding venues and asks what I think would be the best decoration. That's what real family is. People who want to be there for you, not those who try to take everything you have. Sometimes I think, if Mom had just rejoiced with me, if she had supported me back then, like Kendra did, like Dad did, I probably would have invited her here every week. She could sit on the porch with a glass of wine, watch the sunset, walk along the shore, and no one would take that pleasure away from her. She could enjoy the lake house without owning it, but she couldn't bear the thought of me owning something she couldn't control. Last weekend, Kendra and I were sitting on the veranda, a warm breeze fluttering the curtains, the water shimmering in the setting sun, and we were sipping red wine, talking about nothing and everything at once. She was sharing her thoughts on a book she'd recently read, and I was simply listening to her voice and feeling grateful to have such a woman by my side. At one point, I turned to her and said, "You know what I love most about this place?" She smiled and asked, "What, dear?" And I replied, "I'm surrounded by people here who truly want to be with me, who come not because they need anything, but because they love me." Kendra took my hand and squeezed it tightly, looking into my eyes. "You deserve it, Patricia," she said. "You deserve to be loved for who you are, not for what you can give." And I knew she was right. I spent too many years trying to buy my mother's love, sending her money, fulfilling her requests, hoping that at some point she would finally see me as a daughter and not just a wallet. But the truth is, some people never change. Now I'm surrounded by a family who chose me, who chose to truly love me. Kendra could have been cold and distant when she married my father, but she chose kindness. She chose me. Dad could have supported Mom through all this drama, but he chose me. Jake could have distanced himself, not interfered, but he chose to rejoice in my happiness. That's what matters. These are the people who will be standing here next spring, on our lawn by the lake, dancing under the garlands and stars, celebrating the beginning of a new family. And my mother. She still drives her old car, still lives in the same house with Richard and Amanda, and probably still complains about how unfair life is to her. But you know what? That's not my problem anymore. I'm tired of wasting my energy trying to earn love where it never existed. I'm tired of feeling guilty for having nice things I worked for. I'm tired of being manipulated by tears and pity. Now I choose different things. Now I choose a world where I'm loved for who I am.